whether the property taxes were under control. She never asked me what grade I was in. Glenn would get on the line for 30 seconds and say something like, "You being good for your grandpa?" The kind of question that doesn't want an answer. Then there was my 15th birthday. Diane had called the week before and promised, her word, that she and Glenn would drive out for the weekend. "We'll bring Brian too," she said. "He wants to see the horses." Brian was my older brother. 3 years older than me, the one they kept. I hadn't seen him since I was 9. I cleaned the guest room. Henry didn't say anything, but he bought a cake from the bakery in town, which was the most he'd ever done for any occasion. The day came. No car on the gravel road, no call until 6 in the evening, when Diane left a voicemail, not even a live call, saying Glenn's business meeting ran long and they'd try for next month. They didn't try for next month. I sat on the porch with a slice of cake I didn't eat and watched the sun go down behind the barn. Henry came out, stood next to me, and didn't say a word for a long time. Then I heard him on the phone inside, and his voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "Don't promise that girl something you won't deliver. You do it again, don't call here." He hung up. That was the most I ever heard him say about my parents. I graduated from the high school in town with a 3.9 GPA and a full scholarship to Oregon State for mechanical engineering. Henry drove me to campus in the old Ford. He carried one of my bags to the dorm room, set it inside the door, and looked around the small cinder block room like he was running a structural assessment. "Ceiling's fine," he said. "Outlets are grounded. You'll be all right." That was his version of a goodbye speech. We walked back to the truck. I hugged him. The first time I'd initiated a hug in 9 years, and he was stiff with it, the way tall men sometimes are when they don't know where to put their arms. Then he coughed. A deep, wet cough that came from somewhere in his chest I didn't like. "You okay?" "Dust," he said. "Ranch dust. Go learn something." He drove away, and I stood in the parking lot watching the Ford get small on the highway. The last thing I saw before it disappeared over the hill was the faint glint of that iron ring on his right hand, resting on the steering wheel. I threw myself into engineering the way Henry had taught me. Find the problem, break it into parts, solve each part, test the whole. The work felt natural, like muscle memory from all those evenings in the workshop. But 2 months in, the phone calls started telling a different story. Henry's voice was thinner every week. The coughs lasted longer. He'd wave it off. "Just the dust." But I knew dust didn't sound like that. By October, I was calling every 3 days. By November, I stopped pretending it was normal. Something was wrong, and he wasn't going to tell me until it was too late. I came home at winter break, 4 months into my freshman year, and knew immediately. The ranch was running, but it was running slower. Gates that Henry would have fixed in a day were held shut with baling wire. The barn roof had a new leak he'd covered with a tarp instead of replacing the flashing, and Henry himself had lost 20 pounds he didn't have to spare. He was 78. The cough had become a permanent resident in his chest, a low, rolling thing that bent him at the waist when it hit hard. I didn't ask his permission. I moved back into my old room and started catching up on deferred maintenance. Replaced the barn flashing, rehung the south gate, rewired the workshop lights that had been flickering for months. And every time I fixed something, I felt the old rhythm come back. The two of us working side by side, except now I was the one holding the wrench steady while he pointed. My competent weakness showed up right on schedule. I did everything myself. I didn't call a ranch hand for help. I didn't hire a part-time nurse. I didn't phone a friend or a professor or anyone. Because I'd learned at 9 years old that the people who were supposed to help you would leave, so you handled things alone. Henry noticed. "You don't have to fix everything in 1 week," he said one morning from his chair on the porch. "I'm not fixing everything," I said. "I'm fixing what's broken." He looked at me over his coffee. "Same thing I said at your age. Didn't work out any better for me. I know some of you are already thinking about a person who raised you when they didn't have to. Hold on to that. If this story is hitting close, comment one word. Who? And subscribe, because the part that changed everything is still ahead. By September, Henry was spending most of his time in the recliner by the living room window, where he could see the barn and the pastures and the line of mountains to the east. He was still sharp, sharp enough to correct my weld technique from across the room by listening to the arc. But his body was done cooperating. One evening, I brought him soup and sat on the floor next to his chair, the way I used to sit on the stool in the workshop. Grandpa, we need to talk about the ranch. No, we don't. If something happens to you, it's handled. He said it the way he said everything, flat, final, like a bolt torqued to spec. Then he added, "There's a woman named Marion Voss, attorney in Bend. When the time comes, she'll contact you. Everything you need is with her." What does that mean? It means you don't have to worry about it. That's not an answer. It's the answer you're getting. He reached over and patted the arm of my chair. Henry's version of a long embrace. I set it up years ago, Iris. You'll see how it works. Just trust the paperwork. I wanted to push. I wanted details, documents, a plan I could audit. That's how my brain worked. The engineering brain he'd built. But something in his voice told me this was one system he'd already tested, and my job was to let it run. So I dropped it. I sat there in the quiet, listening to the pump in the irrigation system cycling on and off, and I let it be enough. I didn't know then what it was. I wouldn't know for months. But Henry Ashford had spent his entire life building things that held up under pressure, and this would be no different. It was a Thursday night in October when Henry told me about the ring. We were in the workshop, him on the old wooden chair I'd dragged in so he could sit while I finished rewiring the breaker panel. The smell of saddle leather and machine oil hung in the air the way it always did, thick and warm, like the room was breathing. He held up his right hand and turned the ring slowly under the work light. "My father wore this ring for 41 years, he said. He was a machinist in Salem, built parts for the sawmills. When he retired, he gave it to me and said one thing: keep what matters, let the rest go." The ring was iron, not decorative, functional metal, the kind you'd use for a bearing sleeve. The outside was worn smooth from decades of work, but inside the band, etched in small block letters, was an inscription. I leaned in close. A date, March 14th, 1962, and 2 words: Ashford Keeps. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means what it says," Henry replied. "The Ashfords keep their word. They keep what they build, and they keep the people who show up." He slid the ring off his finger and held it up between his thumb and forefinger. It caught the light, dull and heavy. "When the time comes, this goes to the person who earned it." He put the ring back on. "Not the person who asks for it." He picked up a pencil and started sketching something on the pad beside him. Always sketching, always designing, even at 78 with lungs full of fluid. I watched his hand move across the paper, the ring glinting with every stroke. "You don't inherit a thing. You earn the right to keep it." I was starting to understand what he meant. Henry died on a Tuesday in November, 2 days before the first snow. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard the silence. Not a sound. The absence of one. The cough that had been his constant companion for months had stopped. I walked to the living room and found him in his recliner, eyes closed, face calm, one hand resting on the arm of the chair and the other in his lap. The window was open an inch, and through it came the creak of the windmill. Slow, rhythmic. The same creak I'd heard the day I arrived at 9 years old. The same creak that had scored every important moment on that ranch. Except now it sounded different. Now it sounded like a door closing. I sat on the floor next to his chair for a long time. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because Henry had spent 10 years teaching me that grief is something you carry, not something you perform. When I finally stood up, I reached for his right hand and slid the ring off his finger. It was warm. The inscription inside caught the light from the window. March 14th, 1962, Ashford Keeps. And I remembered what he'd said in the workshop. "When the time comes, this goes to the person who earned it." His last instruction to me had been simpler. 3 nights before he died, when his voice was barely above a whisper, he'd pressed the ring against my palm and said, "Keep it where they can see." I didn't understand what that meant. Who was